The great Pax Romana, the Roman peace that began with Emperor Augustus in the 1st century, was a 2-century-long period of relative imperial security and prosperity. Though, as we've seen in our course, there was much discontent underneath that veneer of cultural and political glory. That period came to an end in the later 2nd century as a result of forces well beyond the control of any emperor. For in the later 2nd century, smallpox first appeared on the scene of history and benefited from the far-reaching trade and communication networks of the Roman Empire as it moved from the Indian Ocean to the Western Mediterranean. We happen to have an eyewitness to this pandemic. Galen, one of the most acclaimed physicians of the ancient world, and he treated patients who had this disease. And he did so as a physician and not as a priest, though he knew nothing of microbes or how smallpox was an airborne pathogen moving by cough, sneeze, or saliva from one to another with a range of about 3 to 4 feet as the area of spread. Many people, lacking Galen's outlook, turned to charms and prayers and libations and sacrifices to the gods. And many statues of the god Apollo, the god of disease, were commissioned in this period in the hope that they would appease the god to stop the disease, which was Apollo's revenge for some offense. The epidemic strained imperial resources and impacted the ability to defend its northern frontier against Germanic peoples. The empire was shook, but it held. It faced recruitment challenges and financial challenges due to the epidemic, but it was not overcome by these challenges. That is, it tested the resilience of the empire, but the empire survived. The Emperor Marcus Aurelius, our Stoic from earlier in the course, wrote in his private journal, which is now called the Meditations in Book 9, Chapter 2, where he exhorted himself to live honestly, without pretense or luxury or pride, or, and I quote, "Do you prefer to settle down with vice? And has experience not yet persuaded you to flee from this pestilence? For corruption of the mind is a far graver pestilence than any comparable disturbance and alteration in the air that surrounds us. For the one is a plague to living creatures as mere animals, and the other to human beings in their nature as human beings." This epidemic returned in the 3rd century, and again we find economic and military challenges. But in this case, there was a new scapegoat. If Apollo was angry, what was the cause of that anger? Well, the scapegoat was an upstart religious movement making gains. This was Christianity. The pestilence raged mid-century, and then again a decade later, and then again a decade after that, and this sapped the vitality of the empire, which in the 3rd century witnessed financial ruin, collapsing frontiers, and recurring civil war. One emperor required every inhabitant of the empire to make a sacrifice to the gods, and this amounted to a simple act of sprinkling incense on an altar, and then each would receive a certificate of fidelity, as you see here. And this was bureaucratic evidence that they were upholding the moral order. But this act Christians refused to do, which was interpreted to reveal that they rejected the moral order and they were enemies of humanity, and persecution began. The Christians were scapegoats for the epidemic and disorder. The persecutions were sporadic as emperors came and went, and the persecution of Christians combined with Christian missionary and organizational activity actually enhanced attention to the church, which offered the hope of an afterlife and community support in this life. And the Christians pointed out that the pagan order had no effective answer to the problem of the plague, answers that the church offered, and adherence increased throughout this period, culminating in the conversion of Constantine in the 4th century and the transformation of a pagan empire to a Christian one. Now, this meant that when the last great epidemic of the ancient world, the first plague pandemic, struck the empire in the 6th century, the Christians had to interpret this in a world where they dominated, unlike the situation in the 3rd century, and some viewed this as a punishment from God for sinful behavior. That is, plague or disaster was God's instrument to chastise rather indiscriminately. Instead of Apollo's revenge, it was now the Christian gods. The plague struck the Mediterranean during the reign of Emperor Justinian, who ruled from 527 to 565. The first half of his reign was one of the most impressive in history by any measure. It was an enormous success. He had reformed the administrative structure of the empire. He had codified Roman law, organized legal training, invested enormously in buildings and infrastructure projects throughout the empire, including the most remarkable construction here, the Church of the Holy Wisdom, Hagia Sophia. And he reconquered much of the territory that had been lost to the Germans in the 5th century. He secured peace with the Persian Empire, and he sought to establish a lasting unity in a very divided Christian church. This was up to the year 540. And then in the year 541, plague arrived in the empire and changed not only the trajectory of the rest of his reign, it impacted the following centuries, as we will see. So where did plague come from? Well, first, we have the black rat, which is a native of Southeast Asia. But over the centuries, with the Roman presence in the Indian Ocean and those trade networks, the rat made its way via ship to the Roman Empire. And then there, it easily spread thanks to the Roman peace of Augustus and those Roman trade networks. The black rat was in place, but it did not have the plague. In the 6th century, rodents from the uplands of western China began to migrate due to climate change, as you will read, and those rodents were the host of the Bacillus Yersinia pestis. And then somehow, the bacillus moved from host, those marmots, to the amplification host, the rats. And the arthropod vector that moves it to humans was the rat flea. Climate disruption in the 530s moved the rodents carrying the Yersinia pestis out of their usual underground colonies, triggering the link to the rodents of the seaborne trade routes. Along the trade routes it went until it showed up in the ports of Egypt in 541, and then moved quickly by sea to Constantinople and then the wider Mediterranean, and then it also moved more slowly by land. The plague was an indiscriminate killer of young and old, men and women, rich and poor, Christian and non-Christian. And the second half of Justinian's great reign now faced financial challenges, recruitment challenges, and the end to Justinian's great vision of reform. And he now began to struggle simply to maintain. And many at the time interpreted the plague as divine punishment by God for sinful living. But this was not the view of everyone. One eyewitness was Procopius, the great historian of the era, and I have included his description of the plague's arrival and its impact on the capital, Constantinople. So be sure to note how he differs from that prevailing view, that is, he offers a different interpretation than that of his Christian contemporaries. The mass death of the 6th century and the crises of the era led many pious folk to view this age as the very end of the world, as the empire weakened, with plague recurring for the next 200 years, finally burning itself out in the 8th century. The population decline and the economic dislocation of the empire opened the door to conquest from the outside, from an area that was much less affected by plague, namely Arabia, paving the way for the Islamic conquests of the 7th and 8th centuries.